So now we are back with the yin and yang symbol that I ended with last time. It's mostly to create the illusion that I know what I'm doing and there's some continuity. There is some continuity actually, although the continuity is mostly in my intellectual tradition. And today I want to talk about binary oppositions, or dichotomies is a more common way to talk about opposites, like black and white, good and bad, young and old, high and low. And what I'm going to do in this video briefly, and then continue in future weeks, it may be many weeks, I don't know, this is a very important topic for me. I'm going to explore what oppositions mean both socially and culturally for everybody, and also what they mean in anthropology. Let's get into it. All right, so we all use those kinds of opposites. We talk about black and white, good and bad. One that I particularly dislike is good people versus bad people. That really annoys me intensely, and I'll talk about that later. But mostly now I want to talk about the binary opposition in anthropology and what it means. And to do that, I'm going to introduce you to two anthropologists. The first is Claude Levi-Strauss. Now his name may look like Levi-Strauss, may look like he belongs to a blue jean company or something like that. But he was like Durkheim and Mauss and many others from the border countries of Alsace-Lorraine between France and Germany that were never fully French, never fully German. They're French right now, and they mostly speak French or German, and many of them have German names, but they pronounce them in the French way. So Mauss, for example, M-A-U-S-S, would be mouse in German, but it's pronounced Mauss in the French way, and Levi-Strauss is pronounced in the French way. So he's in the middle, and in the middle between two opposites is going to be my theme over and over and over. So Alsace-Lorraine are in between, enemies actually a lot of the time, the French and the Germans. I mean, they were enemies in the Franco-Prussian War, they were enemies in the First World War, they were enemies in the Second World War. One hopes that they're not enemies anymore in the European Union, but they do symbolize that land, that place between opposites. And that's really my beginning topic, and it was very important for the development of structuralism in anthropology under Claude Levi-Strauss. Secondly, I'm going to talk about Victor Turner. Victor Turner was a British social anthropologist interested in rites of passage. And the two rites of passage that I'm going to talk about, not in this video, but at some point, maybe a little bit in this video, but mostly later, are marriage and puberty rituals. Now, marriage we know about. The three great rites of passage in the Western world are birth, marriage, and death. And in my profession as a pastor, in the Presbyterian tradition, we call them hatch, match, and dispatch, because they are the three times that people go to church. They don't go to church for anything else, but they go for hatch, match, and dispatch. And the interesting thing about those three is that you don't have any choice about your birth and your death, but you have a lot of choice about being married, and it requires a special kind of ritual because it's culturally determined, not naturally determined. And there we can go back to Levi-Strauss for a minute, because he thought that the great opposition was nature versus culture, that humans are sort of intoxicated by or bewildered by or in some ways entangled by the fact that we are natural, we are animals, we're mammals, we are related to other mammals, particularly to apes, but we don't want to think we are. And so we build a cultural armor around ourselves to say we are different. So a bee makes a hive, kind of like a giant apartment building and factory. It's a honey factory. And yet we call the bee's apartment building and factory, we call that natural. But if we build an apartment building or build a factory to make some sweet something, then we call it artificial, which is another way of saying cultural, that we are doing something to the environment. Now it's very, we could say egocentric, but we're actually going to use the word anthropocentric, from anthropos meaning human. So it's very human-centric, but we are, because we're human. We can't empathize with the world of cats or ants or bees. We're conscious of ourselves. So that's going to be my starting point. The opposition between nature and culture under Levi-Strauss, and then I'm going to look at Victor Turner and rites of passage, and I'm particularly going to focus on the puberty ritual which exists in many cultures, including in segments of Western culture. In Jewish culture, for example, the bar mitzvah for boys is a rite of passage, turning a boy into a man. Now with rites of passage, the peculiarity is that the opposition is not clear. When does a boy become a man? In Western cultures in general, it's really difficult to say. Is there a particular event? Is there a particular thing? Like when you get your first driver's license, when you graduate from high school. What is that point? We don't really have one, and I've said for many, many decades that I think that's a big problem in Western culture, because some people go on to be 30, 35, maybe even 40, and they're still kind of children. They haven't really grown up. Some people used to say, and I agree with this to an extent, that a man changes from a boy to a man when his father dies, which in the old days would mean, you know, maybe in his 30s or 40s. Now, who knows, you could be in your 60s before your father died. I was 31 when my father died, and I can understand that transition. That means that I am now the elder generation in my family, the oldest man in my nuclear family. All right, so those are just sort of laying the groundwork. Now let's get down to some specifics. So some anthropologists, going back into the 1960s and 70s, believed that building binary opposites like good and bad, night and day, and all the rest of them, was a fundamental aspect of human consciousness. And part of this came from the fact that the brain has synapses in it, and neuroanatomists and neurologists were beginning to understand about how neural networks work and how synapses can either be firing or not firing, so that if you build a gigantic neural network of synapses that are either on or off, you can describe it in binary terms, literally using binary arithmetic. Binary arithmetic is based on 1 and 0, and of course is the fundamental component of digital computers. And digital computers were also being developed in the 1960s. And anthropologists grabbed hold of this and said, well, if on and off and binary opposition is the building block of the brain, then maybe it's also the building block of thinking. And let's look at binary oppositions in culture. And they argued that binary opposition was fundamental to all cultures. And Claude Levi-Strauss built a huge academic empire on opposition, whether it's about food, and he wrote a very famous long book called The Raw and the Cooked, and he juxtaposed two binary oppositions, culture versus nature and transformed versus untransformed, and built what we call the culinary triangle. I'll have much more to say about that in later videos also. And he saw binary opposition also in marriage and in kinship and in culture in general. So I'm going to explore Levi-Strauss at some length, probably in the next video. I just want to touch on some small points right now. I'm going to start with the book of Genesis. I've actually written a book on Genesis, and one of the first chapters is on creation. And I want to focus on the first 3 days of creation and what happened on those 3 days. Probably you all know, on the first day, God looked out at the waters and the darkness of the cosmos and said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And then what he did after that is really amazing and not always well understood, because in the ancient Judaic tradition, darkness was a thing. In modern physics, darkness is the absence of light, but in the Judaic tradition, darkness was its own thing. So God made light, but if it mixed with the darkness, which they conceived of as possible, then it wouldn't be very much. You'd have a kind of light-dark mix. So the next thing he did, and this is so critical, he separated the light and the darkness. And then there was morning and there was evening, the first day. As far as the ancient Judeans were concerned, light was its own thing. It wasn't created by the sun, it wasn't created by the moon or anything else, it was its own thing. And the separation is really important because it creates a binary opposition. And from there we go to day 2. So now on day 2, God looks over at the light separated from the darkness, and he sees the primeval waters, and they are everywhere. So he takes the next step and he separates the water above and the water below by creating a big dome, and then some of the water stays below on the ground and some of it he puts above the dome. And this explains why the sky is blue, because water is blue. In actual fact, water is a very tiny bit blue, but the reason that oceans and lakes are blue is not because the water is that blue. That's another story. As far as the ancient Judeans were concerned, the ones who wrote Genesis, the water above was above the dome, the firmament, the sky, and it made the sky blue because it was up there above the dome, and the dome had windows in it that God could open, and when he opened them, then it rained. And then there was water below, and that was the second day. And then there was a third day, and on the third day God looked at the ground and it was all watery, and so he separated the dry land from the sea, and that was day 3. And so now you have 3 zones created by 2 separations, 2 binary separations. There's down and up, and there's sea and dry land. And now he populates those 3 zones. On the 4th day, he creates the sun and the moon and the stars and puts them in the dome. They are not sources of the light. The light is its own thing. In fact, the light is a creature. But they are signs for day and night, and they populate the dome. Then on day 5, he populates the sea, and on day 6, he populates the dry land. So you have these 3 zones, each populated by different things, each created by God. And he also separates the things that he's created into things that are clean and things that are unclean. Unclean to eat, unclean to touch, unclean to sacrifice. That's a story for another time, but it leads us back into Claude Levi-Strauss and his whole separation of oppositions in one way or another, also subject of another video. What I want to just mention now in conclusion for today is that the Hebrew word for separate is the same word as the word for holy, kadosh. So the act of separation is the primeval act of creation by God, and he has made things holy by separating them. Now, here's the problem. When you have opposites, there's always going to be something that is not one thing and it's not the other thing. And that causes a problem for humans. In the case of day and night, then there is dawn and there is dusk. And those are the times when it's not quite day, it's not quite night. And those days, those parts of the day actually take on special significance because they mix the two. Now let's just turn to Victor Turner very, very briefly. I'll talk more about him much, much later. He uses a term which he got from the French anthropologist Arnold van Gennep, the term liminal. And it comes from the Latin word limen, which means the threshold of a door, the place where you're not in the room, not outside the room, you're in the middle. And he created liminal and liminality. And they are very important terms in anthropology for defining things that are not one quite, not the other quite. They are in the middle of opposites. And it's actually very important that in Genesis, each day is marked. It says there was evening and there was morning. It does not say, actually in the Hebrew it says there was dawn and there was dusk. There were these middle zones, and they in some ways define what a day is. A day in Judaic tradition and still in modern Jewish tradition ends at dusk. That's very different from the modern Western notion of days beginning at midnight. We'll also talk about that, what midnight is. Midnight's a liminal zone too. There's so much to explore. For the moment, I just want you to hold on to the idea of the liminal, because liminality is created by opposites because the opposites are not real. Good and bad, black and white, young and old, up and down. There's always going to be a middle zone. Let me introduce you one more anthropologist, Mary Douglas. Mary Douglas said that that middle zone is dangerous. All humans find that middle zone dangerous. Not just Westerners, not just Asians, not just Native Americans or Australian Aborigines. All cultures in the world find that middle zone problematic, and they need to keep it pure because it's dangerous. It's also a place of power. All right, I've introduced you to a lot of basics. In the next videos, I'm imagining I'm going to be doing this almost until Christmas. I don't know. It's a long topic, and it happens to be my particular speciality in anthropology. So we're going to be talking about this a lot. Just for the moment, bear in mind that binary opposites are an artifact of human thinking, and that because they are artifacts of human thinking, there's always going to be some slippage, some problems that we need to deal with. And in the coming weeks, I'm going to show you how different cultures deal with that slippage, with that liminality, with that middle zone, mediators. They call it a whole bunch of different things, but it's all the same. It's the power of the middle zone. See you next time.